So it's 5:30. So as promised, we will start sharp as we have a lot of questions coming in. So good afternoon to everyone. First of all, thank you for registering and for taking part in this meeting webinar about science communication. My name is Ruben Rioza. I'm the vice chair of the communication working group of the Marie Curie Alumni Association, and I'm the managing editor of the publication of the newsletter itself. I simply want to remind you that we are currently registering with webinar. So if you don't want to be recorded, you're allowed to switch off your camera and to follow. As we have received multiple questions for the questionnaire that I sent out for the registration, I will moderate the session and I will ask most of the questions directly by myself. And at the end of the session, about for the last 10, 15 minutes, more or less, we will have a question answer session and you will be allowed to directly ask your question to James and Alexia from the chat or directly on live. So we will start right away the webinar, but first of all, of course, I would like to introduce our speaker. So she is a chemical engineer by training, and Alexia Youknovsky is the founder and CEO of Agent Magier, which is a science communication agency. And 13 years ago, she identified the need to create a structure dedicated to professional to research and communication. Now she leads a team of science communication professionals that are all PhD level scientists or engineers. She helps researchers to promote their work through strategic planning, event production, communication trainings, videos, graphic design, and various other activities. And then we have Dr. James Powers, who completed his PhD in molecular biology and physiology in 2014 from the French Natural History Museum, funded as well by a Marie Curie Action. He continued his studies with a Master of Science in Science Media Production from the Imperial College in London, funded by the Wellcome Trust. He has now accumulated nearly 10 years of science communication experience, from science writing to TV, documentary, web content, and events, and has trained in public speaking and science writing multiple person. He is currently the chief editor at Polytechnique Insight, and which is a science media for the Institut Polytechnique de Paris. And together, and this is how I met them, they wrote the book Sell Your Research, which is edited by Springer. And I would definitely suggest you to read the book. And if you want to know more about public speaking and how to better communicate your science. So first of all, thank you very much for joining our webinar and to accept to have this interview and for your time to both of you, James and Alexia.
Thank you, Ruben.
So to start, we have divided your question in 3 major topics, and we will go right away with the first one, which is communication plan, tips, and targeted audience. So the first question would be that most of us are scientists. So James, why would I need a communication strategy? Why is it important?
Yeah, so I think it's important to kind of think about why you would need a strategy in the first place, right? So a strategy is going to help you get the most out of any communication that you do, right? So it will help you make the most of the time that you put in, the energy, the money, and get the most out of the networks that you might create through it. So I mean, there's 3 kind of situations that I've kind of thought about, but there are more. I think the first is if you published a paper, for example, and you want to get the kind of findings that you've published more noticed. Another might be that you're holding an event that you want to maximize on, right? So, I mean, we're in an event right now, but there may also be a talk or a conference or a poster session. You may want to get the most out of the energy that you've put into that. And a third may be that you might actually have funding as part of your, or it may be an obligation, sorry, of your funding that comes with, European funding often has that kind of necessity with one of the work packages. So you may already have the obligation to do that anyway. So you may as well get the most out of it by planning and having a full strategy around that. And trying to make the most out of it. I mean, I think something important to bear in mind when you're thinking about what kind of communication to do and a strategy that you might have is also whatever institution or university or funding body you are involved with, they will probably have their own communications team and a press team, and you should kind of, you can always call upon them to see what kind of resources they may have as well that might be able to help you maximize on those opportunities that I just mentioned.
Yeah, thank you. So we have seen that this is highly important, and you also mentioned that we might have some example and some help for the resources, but I would like to ask to Alexia then, which are the steps that we should use to build our communication strategy?
Okay, so when we build a customer communication strategy with our customers, we ask ourselves let's say the 5 W's, which are 5 typical questions that you may ask yourself every time you have to communicate, which are why you communicate, who you communicate with, what you want to communicate, where you want to communicate, and when. And this is the question that the questions that we will ask to our customers, and that help us define a communication strategy. So for the why, usually we don't communicate just to give information to the general public or to be understood. There are other objectives. And for instance, it can be increase your visibility, get funding, as James just mentioned. It can be develop partnerships, reassure the general public regarding a specific topic that they are scared of. It can be prove your expertise. So these are the kind of reasons why it's important to communicate, and it's important for you to define your own objectives regarding your own research project. So after you define why you should be communicating, then you should define who you are communicating with, who are your target audiences, because you may not want to talk to everybody. Target audiences might be internal in your research institute, in your department, for example, your manager, your colleagues, but the targets can also be external. That is to say, your peers, for example, the general public, policymakers. So it's very important also to list your target audiences and to prioritize them. Because, well, who do you want to talk in priority? That's very important too. Then there's the what you want to communicate. And generally speaking, it's a message that you want to convey. So this message should take into account your own objective and the objectives of your audience. And it should be specific to you and your research project. And this is mainly what you want to communicate, a message. But it has to be defined. It's not that easy because it should be short and precise about you and what you do. Yeah. Then you should define where you want to communicate. It can be obviously printed material, for example, a brochure, leaflets. It can be on a website, on a blog, on social network. It can be related to press relations. So you have also to define where you want to communicate, taking into account your target audiences, obviously, because they might not use some of these communication media. Or they might prefer some others. Yeah. So once again, you have to define where you want to put your money and your energy, depending on them and which media they might be using. And the last question you should ask yourself is when you want to communicate. And that's very important because you can decide to communicate during certain specific moments that are important for you, for example, a specific finding on your research project or a prototype that you've made. You can decide to communicate continuously. For example, once a month, you decide to write a blog article, or you can also decide to communicate when there's a crisis. And that's very interesting also. So for example, during the pandemic, obviously, we've seen scientists all over, researchers all over, talking on TV, on radio, in the press, because the general public and everybody wanted to have some insights by those people who knew, maybe not about the COVID itself, but about epidemiology, for example. So everybody wanted to have their opinion, but there are other kinds of crises that can be expected and where it may be interesting for you to communicate. For example, if you're, let's say, a bird specialist, you may want to communicate when there's an oil spill, in the ocean, or a big forest fire, for example, in Amazonia or in Australia, you may have something to say regarding this crisis. And as a researcher, it's a good opportunity to grasp, to talk about your research project and your research findings. So that's what I recommend. Really think about that, the why you want to communicate, who you want to communicate to, what, where, and when. So that's how you build a communication strategy.
Yeah, and I think also talking with my colleagues that when most of the scientists talk about, and one of the most difficult things is to deal with different audiences, because we are used to talk to other scientists. So also, especially with your who point, so that we can talk to policymaker, general public, or scientists itself. So how should we deal with different target audiences? Which would be your suggestion, Alexia?
You have to put yourself in your audience shoes. So you have to think about them and what is interesting for them. So for example, if you're the general public, you're curious about learning new things and maybe reassured on certain topics. You want some information. Maybe you don't have a specific objective, but you want information, you're curious, okay, on certain topics. If you're talking to your peers, for example, they may want to know exactly what you're working on, the results that you've had, the tools that you're using. If you're looking for partners, that's what of interest for them. If you're talking to sponsors, funders, obviously they will be interested in a return on investment. It might not be financial. I mean, it's not all about money. It can be what you do for the common good with your research project. That's of interest for them. If you're talking to policymakers, then it might be interesting for them to understand what they can do with your research findings, and if it can help them to make better decisions. So the idea is really to put yourself in their shoes and try to talk about the topics that interest them.
Okay, thank you very much. And then the question would be, we have created our plan, we are making action, so we are trying to realize our plan. So the question would be then, and I would like to ask it to James, what do you usually use as an indicator of success or our communication? So how we should assess that our science communication is actually effective or not?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a whole host in marketing communication. There is a whole host of different key performance indicators that people will use and study and analyze to the death of them. But I mean, like in terms of like what you guys, as a researcher, you know, what's kind of useful for you in kind of the amount of effort, I guess, that you guys would be able to put in is to look at them in as quantitative indicators and qualitative indicators. So the quantitative indicators are things like how many people saw my video, how many people read my article, how many people opened my email that I sent, how many people liked and shared and retweeted and commented. And you can really collect a kind of a body of kind of quantitative data that can really help you find out. I mean, like when we're doing things on, let's say, a researcher alone scale or a lab scale, these numbers aren't going to be huge, right? And that's okay. That's completely fine. I mean, I think the second thing for me in this context is actually more important. It's the qualitative data that you're going to collect. So the questions that you want to be asking is, okay, so maybe 10 people retweeted my tweet, but who are those people? You know, are they interested? Are they scientists or are they non-scientists? Are they, you know, are they in my country? Are they on the other side of the world? And that can really kind of help you understand, like Alexia said, whether you actually reach the audience that you were hoping for, right? So things like if you do a blog article on your own blog or on someone else's, you or they can see where those people came from who clicked on the article and how long they spent there. And those kind of things are very useful because they can, first of all, help you confirm that you've reached the right audience, but also if you don't really have a specific audience in mind from the beginning, it can help you kind of gauge the kind of people that are interested in what you're doing. And that means that you can target someone who maybe you didn't think about, right? And so then you can help you keep building up an audience because you are creating content that those people want to use. I mean, that's something that YouTubers do all the time, right? They know who's watching and how much time those people have watched their videos, and they will kind of make content for their audience. What I will say is that if you do work with the media, for example, and I don't know, maybe you've been interviewed or you have participated in some kind of event or something, or were in their newsletter, you can also ask them for their metrics, right? Those people, for example, will be used to collecting them, right? So for example, the website that I work on, Polytechnic Insights, I spend a lot of my time looking at how many people have read our articles and who looks at them and who looks at my emails, and you know, if I send my email at this time, is it better than if I send it this time? And so if somebody asks me, you know, how many clicks did we get on that article, I can tell them, and I know, and so those people can then evaluate that. And I have done that recently. I was myself interviewed, and they kindly put a link to our website in the newsletter that they sent out. And a few weeks later, I mean, not straight away, because you need people to actually have time to look at the newsletter and click on the link, but I asked them, you know, how many people have clicked, and they were able to tell me. And I knew that whilst it wasn't a huge number of clicks, let's say, their audience is a very specific audience. It was actually for people for just finishing their PhDs, which, you know, are the kinds of people that I'm targeting. And so, you know, it was definitely worthwhile my time doing it. And I think you guys could, you know, it's also worth doing to know whether the time put in was worth what you got out of it, and whether it's worth doing again, really. Yeah. So.
So basically from your answer, we have seen that we have different ways also to assess our success, but at the same time, you have explained that we can use blogs, articles, social media. So I would like to ask to Alexia, which media are currently being preferred for science dissemination? So how could I fit them in our strategy? Should I choose them? Do you have some tips on how to choose them? So what should be your guideline?
Okay, well, let's say traditional medias are still very good to consider. Obviously, a scientific article or a conference talk or poster, general media, but there are other media that are expanding, and in fact they were expanding even before the pandemic, but there's a huge increase, of course, in online events, for example, like this webinar, but live sessions as well. So this is very trendy. There are more and more videos that are produced. That's what we see in our agency. There's more and more people that use social networks. And obviously, there are less people going to in-person events or lab visits or things like that. So what I can say is that the idea, obviously, is to mix, let's say, traditional scientific media and well, more digital ones. And as I said before, it depends on your audience, on your target audience. Of course, I mean, for example, TikTok is working very well with the young, you know, young people but if you're targeting policymakers, I'm not sure using TikTok will help you much. For example, you know, or Twitch. Obviously, this is not the best choice you can make. So what I suggest, what we do as a communication agency is that we go and look at what people do. We go and check what do they use. Sometimes we ask to our target audiences what kind of media they use. And of course, it helps us make the right choices because you don't have that much time, you don't have that much money, so you have to make the best decisions. So if you've asked your target audience, or if you at least made the reasoning of, okay, what are they using? What do they like? So once again, put yourself in their shoes and it will help you choose the right media.
Yeah. And already we started talking about social media, and we know that sometimes when we talk about social media, they are associated to more on a popularization, which is not always true. But so my next question will still be to you, Alexia, and I would like to ask you are there some topics that are more difficult than others when you need to communicate, or for you as an expert in a communication agency, everything can be communicated in the same way?
Well,
everything is easy or everything is difficult?
No, well, everything can be communicated, that's for sure. We are very, very lucky enough to be working on space transportation or health topics or agriculture or energy. Well, it's great, and it's great fun to be able to talk about all those topics and to communicate on all those topics. But obviously there are some subjects that are easier than others. For example, if you're talking about a topic that everybody can understand, it's easier when it's, when it's concrete, when it's tangible, when it's visible, when people can actually see what you're working on. It's easier. It's easier also to communicate on trendy topics. For example, if you're working on artificial intelligence, or if you're working on clean energy, it's easier. It's easier because people have heard about it a lot already. So they have a kind of culture related to that topic. And it's easier because you will get more attention because it's a trendy topic. So that's also interesting. It's easier to talk about a topic which has an application that you can see in your everyday life. If you're working on a system, parking aid system for a car, for example, everybody knows what a car is. Everybody knows that it's difficult to park your car sometimes. So, well, it's an easy topic. There are topics that are more difficult because they're abstract. For example, it's not easy to talk about mathematics. Some topics are also difficult to understand, like computer science or electronics. It's not easy. And in general, fundamental research, when there's no application that you can be thinking about right now. So it's not easy. But obviously, it's possible, it's challenging, it's just a question of creativity. You have to find the way to show how important your topic is for society.
So James, also you as a scientist, let's say, as a background, you have also a PhD. So you for sure you have experience that sometimes you talk with other scientists and they tell you, yes, I tried to explain my research to other people and they didn't understand anything about what I said. So the question would be, how could we improve? So what would be the secrets to also try to transmit difficult messages of our research to the general public or to person who doesn't really follow our research?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing here is that, well, I guess we're talking about talking to other people, so communicating verbally, right? So one of the advantages of verbal communication is that you actually have generally somebody in front of you, right, that you're talking to. And so, I mean, there are a few things that when we're trying to explain something quite complex, we just kind of forget about, and they just kind of, how we would normally talk on a daily basis, because it's something complex, we just kind of seem to forget how to use it. So, I mean, the first thing I would say is definitely try and make a plan, right? If you can. So if you know that you're going to be talking to a journalist, if you know that you're going to be doing a poster session or a presentation, or if you know that you're going to a committee where you're going to have to talk to people about a specific topic, then you can have an idea in mind of what those people know, what they don't know, and what you need to tell them or how best to tell them. So what do I say? Make yourself a quick plan. I mean, that can be something that you jot down. It can be in the shower in the morning. It doesn't necessarily have to be something that's really well thought out, but before you get somewhere, do think about what you're going to say. That does help, right? It doesn't matter if you leave out some bits that you thought you were going to say, but at least you're going to be less stressed at the time. And then there's two other things that I think are kind of more to do with like just human communication in general. So the first thing is to pay attention to the people who you're actually talking to, right? Sometimes when we lose ourselves in a really complex explanation, we actually forget that we're talking to another person or a group of people, right? It might just be one person, it might be a crowd of people who are around your poster conference, or it might be, a whole room of people in a talk or something. Look at those people, right? Look at do they look like they understand you? Do they look like they're listening? Do they look like they're paying attention? Are they looking at their phones? Do they look like they're thinking about going to the toilet? pay attention to those people, and you will understand whether they understood something or not, right? I mean, it's something that we often say in kind of presentation skills is, I mean, you can tell if people are listening if they laugh at your joke, right? Or if they do the right thing at the right time, if they react when you expect them to. It doesn't mean that you have to be a professional actor or something. It just does mean that you're actually just paying attention to the people in front of you. And the last thing is that you can always ask for feedback. And I don't mean like a full-on like feedback question form. I mean kind of more like, you know, if you're talking about something or presenting something, you can always say, did that make sense? You know, you can check with them. You know, do you need me to go over that another time? Is there anything I missed? Should I go back onto that slide? And I think the face-to-face communication is the joy of it. You can completely adapt yourself to the people in front of you. And if you didn't get it right the first time, then explain it a second time. Just try it a different way the second time than it was the first time. So, yeah.
And then I think that another problem could be related to research uncertainty. And sometimes we also have a problem where we have some result, but maybe at the same time we have some deal with some companies, so we are not really quite sure if we can actually tell everything about the results. So James, how would you approach this from a communication point of view?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question about uncertainty is one of the biggest questions in science communication right now, right? So there are people, especially with the pandemic, but that was just a catalyzer because it was already something that was kind of being talked about a lot, is how do we get, you know, people who are non-scientists in any field to understand that these results aren't necessarily certain 100%, right? I mean, between scientists, I think that there is that understanding of uncertainty, even if it's just talking about statistical measures and things like that. But also it may be, we need to confirm these data. These are preliminary data. Scientists understand those kind of things, whereas somebody who, you know, is a little bit further away from the scientific community, even a journalist or a policymaker, may not quite get those terms. And so the truth is that, you know, there isn't one right way to do it. And I think there are lots of people trying to find how best to do that. I mean, what I will say is that honesty is the best policy. If you are uncertain, say that you're uncertain about something. I think we are in a world, especially now, where we are in a society that, you know, craves kind of for and against, a media who wants to have a for and against an argument, whereas science isn't always that way. And it's a lot more uncertain than we think. And so I think anybody who is involved in science and science communication, we kind of all have a responsibility to kind of make people aware of the fact that everything that we may think right now is not set in stone, because it could change. And how, you know, how we kind of deal with that is still up in the air. I mean, there are a couple of things that I did note down that I thought may be worth saying, because I think there are a couple of rules that I personally, in my personal opinion, would say. The first thing being, don't say anything you don't actually know or don't understand to be correct at that time. So things may change. That's fine. So that's okay. That's science. But I mean, like, if you don't know or you don't believe them to be true at that time, there's no point saying them. Don't be afraid to say I don't know. Don't be afraid to say I don't know yet. You can also, if results aren't published, don't say that. If the results are yet to be confirmed, then say that, you know, all of these things. But the last thing I would say is that be vigilant sometimes when interacting with media, because they will be looking for a position on a question rather than not always an explanation of a response. And so you should kind of be careful with how you feed into maybe this kind of for and against idea that keeps coming out. And it's good that you asked that question, because actually we have a group of articles that have just been published today. They'll be out in our newsletter tomorrow, kind of about that question, right? So the title of the dossier is, what does it mean to trust science? And so, you know, it's kind of about how do we get those scientific measures, including uncertainty and the scientific method, how do we kind of get them more into the public eye so that people understand them a bit better, and, you know, can kind of understand that science, the way that science works, it's not always certain. Yeah.
Yeah. And then Alexia, let's say that we have managed to write our thesis, our article is now published and it's amazing, we are super happy, but now we are to a second point where we want to disseminate to the general public, so we want to target a general audience, and we think that it's easy, but we realize it is super difficult. So what tips would you give to a scientist that wants to make their thesis or their research work understandable to common people?
So first of all, I want to say that there's a difference, obviously, between a lay audience and an audience of peers, but your peers might not be expert of your own domain. So it's not what I'm going to say here is, I can explain how to talk to a lay audience, but it doesn't mean that you don't have to think about that when you talk to your peers, but that are not specialists of your own topic. And that's the point. It's very difficult to assess the level of knowledge of an audience, even an audience of scientists or experts, but that are not experts of your field. When you do that, when you talk to non-experts or lay audience, you have to take a step back and figure out what they might not know. At Jean-Major, I talked about the 5 W's at the beginning of the webinar, and I have the 6 C's for popularization tools. So we've grouped tools and techniques of science popularization, and they all begin with a C, which is quite interesting. And I suggest to use them. So I'm going to tell them which are the 6 C's. So it's clarity, it's connection, it's context, concreteness, color, and conversation. So first, clarity is obviously, well, use words that people can understand. If you use jargon, then define it and avoid, if possible, acronyms. Okay, that's quite simple, but it's always good to remind it because very often people don't realize that the words that they use every day are not words that their audience is familiar with. So that's first thing. Then connection. Well, we're human beings, so we have feelings, we have emotions, and it's good to work on that. So if you use emotions to connect with your audience, it will help them get concentrated and feel concerned. So for example, if you use humor, you make them laugh, or if you surprise them, or if you scare them. Sometimes it's interesting to scare people and say, okay, if you don't do that, okay, this terrible thing will happen. Sometimes it's useful if you want people to act after your talk or your communication. So that's the connection related to emotion. So how to convey emotions to your audience. Then the third C is context. So you have to talk about the context in which you are working. So, for example, economic context, cultural context, it can be a scientific, social context. So, what context are you working in? And if possible, it's also nice to be able to talk about the applications of your research projects, possible applications. Then be concrete, concreteness, it's all about showing things, showing real things, because people like to see real things like samples, demonstrations. It's great to see models, prototypes, and it really gives another a vision, another way of seeing your work using demonstrations, and that's very powerful. Then colors, it's about, well, using for example, schematics or graphs. That's very important as well. And the last C, the 6th one, is make conversation. And it's something James already mentioned. So it's good to have interactions with your audience whenever possible. That is to say Q&A, in order for them to be able to ask you questions and to interact with you. So these are the 6 C's, and we've written a blog article about those 6 C's. To me, it's kind of a mix of all the tools that that can be used in science popularization.
Thank you. And then I think another problem when it comes to science, and especially in research, is that we have, for example, a PhD is a three year long or 4 years long study, and you do multiple analysis and you do many different methodology to get then a couple of results that means the same thing or works around the same thing. So the question would be to James, how to make communication direct to the point in a short time without like diverging of different methods or different analysis that we have done?
Yeah, I think, I mean, as Alexia already said, like it is worth sitting down and thinking about what the message is, right? So what the main point is. And I think that is the most important thing. Like, even if it's a thesis, I mean, I have kind of trained people to write PhD theses, right? And one of the first things we did was, you know, spend time trying to break their thesis topic down into one sentence, right? And this isn't the title, because people kind of get that mixed up. The title is very specific and has to have keywords and whatever, but it doesn't necessarily describe really what the take-home message of your PhD thesis is. And I mean, you don't have to necessarily even tell anybody what that message is, but you have to have it in your mind, right? So you need to be able to break it down into one sentence. And I mean, I think what you just said there is, yes, we use different methodologies, we might have different approaches and things like that. Each of those things can also themselves be broken down into a small message, right? So you can have one overall kind of main take-home point for your entire thesis. And you can also have one for your first chapter or your second chapter or your third chapter, or you can have one for the first part of the first chapter, right? So each bit, each block in itself can have a message. And then the second thing is cut the fat, right? So you need to get rid of things that you don't need. And it's really hard to do because I think we kind of generally get emotionally attached to the amount of energy that we've put into things. So, I mean, if you've written a paragraph and you know later that it's not there, it doesn't make sense and you don't need it, it's really hard to delete it because you've spent time doing it, right? And like, I don't know, when you're making a PowerPoint presentation and you have to cut out 5 slides and you know, it's really frustrating. I mean, for those things, the best thing I think to do is to accept that we are emotionally attached to those things. And so what I do is I generally in writing, I have like a, I have what's it called, a trash can. So what I do is when I'm kind of re-editing a text, I'll put paragraphs that I want to, or text that I want to remove, I'll put it in kind of like another bit later that's kind of like a trash can that I can come back and take if I want it. It kind of helps me to kind of get over the you know, over the sadness of removing it. And I mean, these are two things that I kind of do now more than ever, kind of on a daily basis, right? So as a chief editor, we're going to spend, with my colleagues, we spend a lot of time, you know, thinking about titles of articles because they're really important, right? So that's what people are first going to see first, and it's also what's going to make them want to read the article, right? So we spend a lot of time kind of mulling over how do we sum up this article in 6 to 8 words, but also make it sound really interesting. And, you know, that is a challenge, and every article with every content is going to be different. So we, you know, it doesn't necessarily, it doesn't take us less time each time, right? So we just have to rethink every time. And also I spend a lot of my time cutting the fat, let's say, on people's articles. So a lot of our articles are written by scientists themselves who will send me their pieces, and they know that the word count is 1,000. And I always get emails saying things like, you know, I did my best and this is, I've cut everything down and this is as short as I can make it. And it's 1,500 words. And I know that they're 50% over the word count. And I spend, you know, I go in and I cut it all out, the bits that we don't need. And people are generally happy with that. And it's because it's easier for me. I'm not emotionally attached to that bit that I'm cutting out. I think that's really what it comes down to. And, you know, those things help you stay on track and just kind of get rid of the bits that you don't need. Yeah.
Yeah. And then since we are in the last 20 minutes, we have also another topic, the last topic of the session that was really, really interesting and a lot of question about it. We are 2 experts here, but how did you start your career in science communication? So how did you get started? What training did you receive? So of course, for this question, I would like both of you to answer. I will start with Alexia, since James just answered, so yeah.
Okay,
please.
so how did I start? First of all, I started 13 years ago. So I'm kind of a veteran of science communication, let's be clear, because at the time I started, I didn't know anything about science communication trainings or you know, a master's in science communication. I don't know if it existed. Some might exist, but well, so I learned along the way. In fact, I'm an engineer myself, so I'm a scientist myself. Then I worked as a consultant for 3 years, and I worked as an actress for 6 years. And then I was asked by my former responsible when I was doing research to make a training, a communication training to researchers. And I thought, okay, he has this need, but maybe other researchers have the same need, and it could be a good idea to propose that. And that's how I created Agent Majeur. But in fact, in the very beginning, people were telling me, okay, but why would we need somebody to help us communicate? We do it all the time. It was a little bit surprising, but year after year after year, people got used to the fact that it was really very important to communicate, and not only important, but also vital to communicate on research. And now the question that they ask us is not why should we communicate, but how? Tell us how to do it and to be effective. So I have, let's say, a background that is quite well, original, specific, strange, but it's what it takes also to become a science communicator. But James, I know he has a different background that he can tell you about, because also he's not such a veteran as I am.
Yes, please, James.
Yeah, so the question, I started, I guess, getting interested in science communication when I was doing my PhD. So it was, I think, back in 2012 was when I was 2 years into my PhD, and I hadn't really thought about what I was really fully going to do afterwards. And I received this email that had been sent around the museum that were looking for PhD students to kind of take part in these web documentaries. And it was a communication website called My Science Work. And it was actually really ahead of its time, I think, because now we see kind of videos about scientific projects and PhD projects all the time. But they really had kind of seen that before, you know, like specific looking at, like, you know, PhD students and trying to do it in a very fictional way anyway. And the way that they did it was just great and interesting. And they came, and I think it was the first time that, like, I'd seen kind of let's say a media type thing really take the time with a scientist and kind of sat down with me and gave me, like, you know, time to explain my project. And the video they made, the series, was actually really good. And that kind of got me really interested. And so whilst I was finishing my PhD, I started kind of you know, taking part in helping out. In France, we have this thing called Fête de la Science, which is like the science festival. It's a national kind of day where lots of labs open up their doors to kind of like the general public. So I was helping out with that. I started a blog and I started like a YouTube channel. Most of those things were pretty terrible. But, you know, like it kind of got me kind of going. And I carried on writing for My Science Work, actually. I did quite a few articles for them. And they eventually became, at the end of my PhD, my first kind of client, my first kind of like journalism client. And I, you know, I thanked them a lot for that. And kind of once I finished my PhD, then I kind of had more time to kind of really dig into it. So I started really getting involved in lots of other things. I mean, I was at one point I was very kind of into film and video, and so I made a couple of clips that won like prizes and in very kind of small science communication type competitions. But at the time, you know, they were kind of like, you know, little kind of things, you know, that really kind of egged me on and kind of pushed me to keep going. I mean, I ended up, you know, kind of on this TV show. I ended up like, you know, doing all sorts of different things that kind of I didn't really expect to do, and kind of driven just by the fact that I wanted to do it. And I then ended up going on my master's course, which was thankfully kind of funded as well by the Wellcome Trust. That kind of helped a lot. And that really kind of professionally gave me a kind of a position of being able to work in media as a scientist. So, I mean, I talk about the funding because it was specifically for PhD students who wanted to go into kind of science media and science communication. So it was you know, a great way to kind of consolidate all the things that I'd kind of done before. Yeah, and I guess that kind of I've kind of lost myself now, but that's, you know, I kind of carried on and I worked for TV shows and things like that. For a good few years, I carried on writing, and then worked with Alexia for a few years at Agent Majeur. Yeah, and then the rest is kind of history. But I think the important thing is that, like, it was all about still loving kind of science and wanting to talk about it.
Yeah, it's all about passion. It's true. It's a great job, and we're very lucky to do it because it's just so fun to to communicate, to work on so many topics that are so different and that are difficult to grasp, and then you make them like easy to understand, and it's great fun.
I think also, like, it's also now, the more that I'm kind of doing this type of job, the more that I'm realizing as well that science communication was initially for me about something very fun. And I think for lots of people, it is like that at the beginning. I think the more that we go on, the more that science communication is happening in the world, I think the more and more we're realizing the importance and the responsibility that kind of that it has to kind of, you know, also make sure that the science being transmitted is correct and is true, and it's not being taken out of context and you know, manipulated by people who may want to, you know, not necessarily use it for the right reasons. So, you know, I think there is also a serious side to it that I think we're all kind of starting to realize more and more. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And then I would open the floor or the screen. So if anyone from the attendees would like to ask a question, feel free to raise your hand or switch on your video, and I will give you the words, or simply type your question in the chat and we will read out for you if you don't want to be seen or whatever. So feel free. And if there aren't questions for the moment, I would like to go on and ask you another question. I know also from the book that one of the also difficult part for a scientist is public speaking, especially when it comes to presentation at the conference or in general talking in front of a lot of people. So what would be your suggestions when it comes to public speakings, Alexia or James? Who wants to start?
In fact, with James, we've been working together for several years. We've been working on a book. We've written together a book on public speaking. And in fact, at Agent Majeur, we've trained like something like 2,700 scientists on public speaking. So it's a topic that we talk about a lot. So there are many tips. To me, the tips that we've shared so far are still useful, because the main thing that you have to think about first is your message. What do you want? Which message do you want to convey, and who are you talking to? What's your own objective? So and to combine that, and also to put a structure in your talk, because well, there should be logic behind. It's obviously, I talked about emotions a few minutes ago. It's important to convey emotions, but in a structured way, you know, with ideas that are put one next to the other and that are logical. So that's one of the few things that I could say. James, I'm sure you have many things to say too.
Yeah, I mean, so sorry, can we just, the question was, how can we
some tips for public speaking? Yeah, public speaking.
Yeah, I mean, as Alexia said, I think the cell method, which Alexia developed, which is what we talk about in the book, is actually a really good way of structuring those thoughts. And I think that a lot of the time, scientists, or as a scientist, you know, there's a kind of this idea that, oh, I'll just throw a couple of slides together and then my presentation will be that, without really kind of sitting down and thinking about it, or I'll just reuse this presentation I did for this thing. And that's kind of, I think, the way to kind of make a good presentation is to adapt your presentation to that situation that you're doing. And so reusing slides and reusing a presentation as a basis may help, but you know, sitting down and thinking about what you want to say, who you're talking to, and what the steps are to kind of do that in a logical order can be really helpful. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, start with a pen and a paper instead of PowerPoint slides, because it will help you.
Yeah, yeah.
And then we have a couple of questions in the chat. I will go for the first one from Afsun, and sorry if I didn't pronounce your name correctly. And he would like to know, how's your daily work routine, especially pre-COVID? But I think also post-COVID could be interesting. So James, you can start.
I mean, I guess it's kind of a question about, I guess, kind of the job, what the requirements are. I mean, pre-COVID, I was actually working with Alexia as a major. So I was a consultant and a trainer. And so I guess every day was very different in the terms of, you know, there was a whole host of different things. I mean, Alexia will tell you different kind of services that you know, Azure Major proposes, but also there's obviously training. So, but those come in as kind of mainly, you know, people need them. You don't need a communication strategy every month, right? So the clients are always going to be different. The topics are always going to be different. So there's a lot of kind of a change. What I do now, I guess, working for a media, is that there's a lot more rhythm to it, right? So, for example, we release once every 2 weeks. The newsletter, for example, is coming out tomorrow. We release a newsletter with new articles, and so those will be all on one theme. So that's much more now on a rolling scheme of speaking to scientists and journalists and getting pieces ready for every 2 weeks. There's my deadline. So I kind of have this like repetitive deadline. All the topics are always different. So, but I do know that every 2 weeks I have to get my articles out. So yeah.
What about you, Alexia?
Yeah, well, the timetable depends on the projects that we're working on. So, for example, at the moment, we're working for on orphan diseases, rare diseases with Orphanet. For example, we're building a brochure, we're building a motion design, a film, PowerPoint slides, visual identity. We're working on space transportation, and we are building a strategy. Well, it all depends. We have a lot of trainings going on right now. So how to write properly, how to make a training, you know, train a trainer, you know. So it all depends on the clients that we have, and it's changing all the time. So that's what I really like about my work. That we see different faces, we see different topics. What has changed before the COVID and now, obviously, is that I stay in my office and I don't see my customers anymore. Well, right now we're starting to do trainings on site again. So, but I don't know. Well, there are some that were planned in June. There are some that are planned in September, and afterwards we'll see.
And looking at the chat, we have a couple of more questions that sort of also went back to our first topic. So it would be, how do you think we should measure the impact of science communication? I think we already answered the question, but maybe it's worth repeating the major key point of what is important when measuring our impact on science communication.
Yeah, James already answered to me this question, but the idea is, it's true, it's not only quantitative, but it's important to be able to measure, to say, okay, for example, okay, now I have how many, well, let's say 100 followers on my Zoom account. Well, if you want to have more, what are you going to do? Do you see an impact? Do you see more visits on your website? Well, sometimes I do agree with James said. It's also qualitative, because sometimes you organize an event and you don't have many people attending, but the 2 or 3 that are very motivated can become partners or funders, sponsors, and so it's difficult to measure.
I think there is a point that we can add in there also, is that reaching the right audience can be that those people directly were involved, but it can also be that each person who you communicate to themselves becomes a relay, right? So we all have our own networks, and so somebody you communicate to may themselves have their own network, who then also have another network, and so the impact is not always visible immediately. You can do all your quantitative and qualitative measures, but also, you sometimes just have to give it a try and kind of keep going. And, sometimes it'll work really well and sometimes it won't.
Yeah, for example, on social media, it's not always easy to see, because some people may not interact with your posts, but still they see them. And for example, I got an interview in a very important French magazine thanks to social media, although the journalist didn't know me. So sometimes just being there and being more or less active can give you great opportunities, and it's very difficult before being there to know what will happen. Well, the more you communicate, the more you'll get, but sometimes it's difficult to know what you'll get.
And then we have another question that would be, what is relevant and what should we focus on as researchers? So I would say that the question would be mostly, what should be the focus of our research? So what is better to communicate, because I think that our research would have many points. So James, for your idea, what would be better to communicate, if there is something that is more important than other things to communicate?
I think, Alexia touched on this a couple of times. I think the important thing is your public, your audience, right? So what do they want to know? And I think there's lots of times when, as a scientist and someone who's spent years doing your research, you want people to know all of that sometimes, and you also want them to know the bits that you like most or that you find the most exciting. But your audience, does have their own kind of time requirements and also their own interests, right? And so the best thing to focus on is what the people want to know about. And that comes from, again, putting yourself in your shoes of those people that you want to talk to and target. However, there is one clause to that, let's say, and I think it's the point of sometimes the public, or this happens sometimes with journalists as well, is that they are looking for an answer to a question, and because that's the question they think that they know about. But as a scientist, you will know things that nobody knows about. And so those things sometimes are the real gems of kind of communication, because you have found, you have some knowledge that is really exciting and new that no one even knew to ask about yet. And kind of identifying those things as well can be, a gold mine in terms of communication for you. Yeah.
Do you want to add something, Alexia, as well on the question?
Yeah, well, there's a song that we have in France, and it goes like that. It says, "Talk about me. That's the only thing that interests me," and and then talk about them, because that's the only thing that interests them.
Yes. We have time for one more question if someone. Yes, we have another one. So if there is time, yes. What makes a good science communicator? That's a good question. Alexia, would you like to start?
Well, what I look, because we're talking about CVs right now, because I receive the CVs at Agent Major. So what I look is that, well, if the person has a scientific background, for me, obviously, it's very important. And if it has either a degree in science communication and or passion for science communication, because people that are passionate about science communication, they have done something in the past. Maybe not professional, maybe it's just a blog. For example, James, he had videos, so he said the videos were not great. Well, personally, I looked at his videos before hiring him, and it was nice to see something, you know. So if you're passionate about science communication, produce things, even if it's for free, because they will be useful for the future in your CV, because well, personally, I will be looking at things like that, because if you're passionate about science communication, you've done things in the past, even if it's not professional.
Yeah. James, would you like to have something?
I would see it just slightly differently. I think I agree with Alexia that you do need a scientific background, some kind of scientific background. Doesn't have to necessarily be to PhD level, but some, you know, something of definitely knowing how science works. You know, that's definitely the groundwork needs to be there. But then Alexia kind of said, I guess, passion or kind of training. I think that those things kind of come together generally in the reality of kind of consolidating really a job. I think that it's rare that people will kind of be hired above other people just on passion, unfortunately, because that passion will get you into testing loads of things and learning loads of things, but you kind of also need to have some kind of evidence that you can make that into a profession, and that people will take you seriously as a professional in it. And I think that's kind of, I had a shift where I was doing lots of kind of things that were passion projects and nobody was really taking me seriously. And that's why I went and did the master's, because it kind of really helped me to kind of have proof, but also kind of open doors to kind of internships. Like, I mean, I was working on documentaries that were on the BBC and things like, you know, I would never have got those kind of opportunities had I not done my master's. And I think that once you've done those things, people will then take you seriously, right? So you kind of need some proof, and also, yeah, both. For me, it's both. The things, the passion projects have to be consolidated with some kind of professional experience. I think that, yeah.
Thank you very much. And then, yeah, our time is finished. So I would like to thank you very, very much for this 1 hour discussion. It was very inspiring, interesting, and we definitely learned way more about science communication, dissemination strategy. And of course, I would like to thank also all the attendees. And I would also like to remind to everyone that there is still the book that you can read, which is Sell Your Research, edited by Springer. I read it and it was definitely inspiring, and it will help you out in writing your thesis or presenting your stuff. It's very, very helpful. So, and I think that you will feel free to get in touch with the authors. If you want, I can drop an email again and send you all the contacts, or you can get in touch with me and we will send out all the information. So thank you very much again to you both.
Thank you, Ruben.
Also check out our website.
Yes.
But thank you very much for having us. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you very much, and bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.